So there's lots of problems with suspension, loss of instructional time, lower achievement, and it's a leading indicator of future incarceration. So actually reversing the pipeline, we need a commitment to change, prevention and intervention. And the commitment to change, it's not easy. And I was listening to Dr. Cole at lunchtime, and I'm like, wow, like Massachusetts is on the ball. Jersey, you gotta get there. But zero tolerance policies are not helpful at all with our young people. It really kind of waves a wide, what is it called, paintbrush on everything. So if I go like, I'm not really pointing a gun, this is my fingers. If I go like this to somebody, that's the same as me bringing in a weapon, and we're both expelled. You know, so we have to be really careful about the policies we're really implementing in our schools. Prevention, training for all staff, but training is always just the beginning. When you think about training, you don't just train the teachers, you also have to train the school counselors, you have to train the secretaries who will deal with parents and deal with the kids as well. You know, you have to, the whole system has to buy in or it won't work. I worked at a correctional facility in Wisconsin for a year, and they tried to make one unit on a whole campus trauma-informed. What's wrong with that? Well, we all know what's wrong with that. You know, all the other kids are like, why doesn't Johnny get sent to the hole when he punches somebody and he gets a teddy bear and a hug? Like, you know, like trauma-informed care has to be a wraparound thing that you have to really attack from the top down, bottom up, sideways, in every which way. Evidence-based interventions for traumatized youth. Again, I'm going to show you some websites, but this one particular intervention is called CBITS, Cognitive Behavioral Interventions for Traumatized Students, and it's evidence-based, it works. They come to your school, they train you, they give you consultation. Again, it's a money thing, but it's through SAMHSA, and they give out grants. Like, I don't know, like, SAMHSA is really doing amazing things. I think Dr. Moore has a SAMHSA grant, and you'd be surprised that there's money out there for this. And then prevention, universal trauma screenings, actually screening every kid that comes in the door for trauma. And it sounds like a huge task. You're not asking Johnny and Kim, you know, who touched you yesterday. It's not those kind of screenings, but it's really, again, on the websites, there are different types of screenings you can use that weed out and show who might be more at risk than other students. And interventions, you know, support teams, personal education plans, IEPs that aren't carbon copy of each kid. Yeah, I mean, I've been at some schools where I've kind of watched the same IEPs just put a different kid's name is on it. You know, actually reading the IEPs would be important too. Right. So, I am the Vice President of the New Jersey Association of Black Psychologists. And I'm also was a national member. If you go onto our site, we do have things about dealing with racial trauma. The National Traumatic Stress Network, nctsn.org, is all about trauma, schools, justice, immigration, culture, and all of its free information, including toolkits you can use in the schools. And then NASP as well, National Association of School Psychologists, they have a lot of information as well. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. So our next speaker is Mark Rosenbaum, who is the Director of Public Counsel's Opportunity Under Law, a public interest law firm that aims to eliminate economic injustice in society. And so when I read that, I just thought, that's just a small goal. So Mr. Rosenbaum is one of the most experienced civil rights litigators in the country. He has argued cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, the Federal Courts of Appeals, the California Supreme Court, the U.S. Court of Military Appeals, and he has actually been lead counsel in so many landmark cases. I actually went and looked some of these up. You know, California's Prop 187, and many cases from K through 12, public and higher education, voting rights cases, poverty law, homelessness, discrimination of all types, race, gender, sexual orientation, immigrants' rights, foster care, criminal defendants, I mean, you name it. He has been the recipient of numerous awards for his advocacy as a civil rights lawyer and has been named California Lawyer of the Year twice. He joined public counsel after 4 decades with the ACLU, and he looks fantastic.
I thought you needed to change jobs every 4 years.
And he has also taught at the University of Michigan School of Law. He was there for 2 decades, specializing in constitutional law and civil rights. And he currently, in addition to his day job, he also teaches at the University of California Irvine School of Law. And in 2015, Mr. Rosenbaum sued the Compton Unified School District for its failure to address trauma in its student population. So today, he's going to tell us about this litigation and its challenges. But to start, we're first going to watch a video that talks about this litigation. So just give me a second to start us off.
I have nightmares a lot, but, you know, as I've gotten older, I've learned how to control them better, or just deal with them. I wouldn't say control, more like manage.
Children who live in high poverty neighborhoods are subjected to extreme stress. There are individuals who, because of their poverty, don't know always where they're going to get their next meal or where they're going to have a roof over their head. Unaddressed trauma among school children is the single greatest public health crisis in America today. Trauma is defined as exposure to extreme stress.
What's happening isn't so much one singular event, but something that's called complex trauma, which is sustained, pervasive trauma over a long period of time.
I used to sleep with my mom and dad. I woke up to my dad yelling at my mom, screaming, "I'm done," pointing a gun at her.
I seen somebody get shot in the head. I was like, hey, my mom don't even know this. Somebody got shot in the back of the head with a shotgun. It was a horrifying sight. You know, I wouldn't wish that on anybody.
We know that children who have 2 or more episodes of extreme stress are 2.6 times more likely to fail a grade. They're 2 times more likely to be suspended. They're 5 times more likely to have attendance problems. They're 6 times more likely to have behavioral problems.
There are appallingly few resources available in Compton schools in order to provide the support that these children need in order to be able to learn.
My dad was beating us. He had socked my mom in the stomach while she was pregnant with my little sister. And then he was gonna punch her again. And that's where I stepped in and he punched me. I panicked and I called 911. And that's where we were taken from our parents.
Many of them have unstable living situations. They might be homeless. Some of them are in the foster system. And many of them experience pervasive discrimination and racism in their community. Another student, Kimberly Cervantes, experienced homophobia in the school itself.
This girl turns around and looks at me and asks me about my sexual preference. She asked me, "Are you gay?" And I told her, "Yeah, I think so." And then my teacher looks at me and says, "Why would you do that? Why would you be gay?"
As is typical for a student who has experienced that kind of trauma, particularly in the school, Kimberly missed many classes.
One of the kids whom we represent was living homeless on the roof of his school.
I used 4 carpets. I put one to cover for the wind and the cold. And then I used one for where I would lay down and one for a pillow.
Compton School District, rather than assisting him, reported him to the police for trespass and suspended him from school. Here's what we know about trauma. Trauma shuts off the brain. It turns off the learning switch.
A student who has experienced a lot of trauma in their lives might have difficulty focusing, difficulty concentrating. A primary response that schools have to trauma is unfortunately to discipline, punish, and exclude children. And that is the worst possible message that schools can send to students.
We're filing the first suit in the history of the country to deal with the fact that there are children who go to school suffering from trauma, and as a result of that, are impeded from learning. What we're asking here is that these children have the same equal educational opportunities as children in other schools. Here's what a trauma-sensitive school does. Instead of saying to the child, "What's wrong with you?" it says to the child, "What happened to you?"
There are different models for what a trauma-sensitive school looks like, but they share core components. The first is that all adults in the school need trauma-sensitive professional development training. Another component is restorative practices, which prevent conflict in the first place and allow students to heal. And then finally, there needs to be mental health support by trained providers on campus. There have been very successful models in Washington State, in San Francisco, and San Diego that have achieved great success and have increased student achievement, have decreased student absences, and have far decreased student behavioral challenges.
The results are astounding. These children are resilient. These children are taught to deal with the trauma, and the academic performance goes up, and their love of learning becomes part of the environment in the school.
Support is somebody that not only just loves you, but actually cares and walk the walk, not just talking.
Mr. Kerr, he's just the type of person where he's actually gotten to know every single one of the students. I think if more teachers were more like Mr. Curry and students would care about their education, you would have a school that actually seemed like a real school.
We're filing this case in Compton, but Compton is not at all the only community facing these challenges.
Dealing with trauma, that's not just a moral imperative, it's a legal imperative. All kids should have a fair chance, and that's what this case is about.
I have a peaceful place, and this peaceful place is when I'm in the mountains and I'm looking up at the stars. I would love to see my school as my peaceful place, where I could be feeling safe, calm, I don't have to worry about anything else. Trauma does affect students. I want to make my school better because I want my kids to go there. And I want my kids to feel safe in that environment.
You can take that down. Well, I'm very glad to be here. I'm very glad to be here this afternoon with you all for a number of reasons. I mean, it's such terrible times that we're going through. It's not like injustice began on January 20th, but everybody knows here it's really rough. Yesterday, didn't get much attention, but yesterday as part of the obscenity that was passed by the House, if that becomes law, and it really doesn't matter, does it, whether it becomes law or not in a sense, because you'd have to hate children to pass something like that. They cut $880 billion for Medicaid, 25%. You know, I think, so many of you have already talked about the problem of resources in the school, which I want to get to. But $4 billion goes to schools for providers for special education. They take that away. They take that away, and we're just going to have another conference to talk about what's to be done, and kids are going to be suffering. The second reason I'm glad to be here, among many, is in 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks, it's the 63rd anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, May 17th. Brown's the greatest case in the history of this country in terms of the Supreme Court. It's a case that was supposed to say equal educational opportunity, that is the constitutional imperative, end of story. Our whole constitutional democracy is hinged upon equal educational opportunity and the availability of public schools to be the great equalizer. That's how you identify the American dream for yourself, And it's how you get the opportunity to execute it. It's how you become a meaningful participant in the civic institutions of the democracy. And what we've heard today, and what all of you know better than I do, is that where children have that learning switch turned off, where they go to communities where so many of their children are in similar circumstances, they don't have a shot, by definition, of equal educational opportunity. You know, I had the privilege a few weeks ago to be in the company of John Lewis, and one of the things they said to Congressman Lewis was, you know, lessons, and he said, you have to find a way to get in the way. And that's what we're here for, to get in the way, which is the third reason it's such a privilege to be here. And that is the urgency. These kids don't have time to have this get worked through. They get second grade once. They get fifth grade once. They get high school once. And every year that goes by, that these kids, and the premise of our public school system, as everybody knows, is that we take kids as they find them. Lawyer on the other side said to me at one point, what do you want to do, Mr. Rosenbaum? Use this court to get rid of poverty? I thought, well, okay. But if we're not going to do that, then we at least have to get rid of the effects of poverty, and the effects of racism, and the effects of sexism and homophobia, and homelessness, and foster care systems. I want to share with you some lessons about three cases. The Cont'd case is one. And I want to tell you everything that you have said about bottom-up, about collaboration. Susan's cold lessons about it's not going to work if there isn't community involvement. Absolutely, every part of that is right. And I'm pleased to tell you, I want to talk to you about the case, but I am pleased to tell you that we are working collaboratively right now with Compton. I was in a meeting this past Monday to bring about a trauma-sensitive environment in those schools that meet the criteria we're talking about, where the sorts of committees that Susan talked about, and Susan's a giant in this area, was the first step involved in the process. I also filed a case on behalf of students in the Havasupai tribal nation. We talked about intergenerational trauma. These are kids who go to schools that end in the 8th grade where there is no subjects beyond reading and math, and there are no teachers to teach them anyway. They have a janitor teaching them. There are no books, and talk about culturally sensitive. They don't have dance, they don't have art, they don't have culture, they don't have books. They don't have anything that is reflective of a culture that robbed them of their homeland. And the third case I want to talk to you about just briefly, if I can, is a case filed in Detroit, the first federal case in the country that seeks right of access to literacy, because all this is bound together, right? All this is absolutely bound together, and part of that lawsuit is schools where, you know, God damn it, those kids literally don't have teachers in the classroom. One of the schools where the case was brought, an 8th grader was teaching because they didn't have any adults there. Kids sit for periods of a day without teachers. I didn't talk to a single kid in that school system that had a book to take home. Their temperatures are 100 degrees or 20 degrees, rats running around the school. That is trauma-inducing too. It's not just outside in. The Compton case is a case that's brought not just on behalf of students, but consistent with what you all have been talking about today regarding community by teachers too. Because I didn't talk to a teacher in Compton who had ever heard the word trauma when she was being educated. And these teachers, this was not in their job description. I asked one teacher, how you know how to deal with it? He said, because I'm from the community. I asked him why he stayed. He said, because if I leave, who's going to be here? But we're all in it. We're all in it together. Let me tell you a little bit about the background, how this came to be. I've been privileged, I've been fortunate to do educational equity cases all my life. And at one point, and I also do cases regarding homelessness, homeless veterans. And I was meeting with Dr. Marlene Wong, who's Dean of Social Work at USC. She spoke at the White House conference as the keynoter on trauma. And I was asking her about that. I had just been with Catherine, my extraordinary colleague. I
we had met with Sean Reardon, a professor at Stanford, and Sean has the definitive study. I understand the problems with tests, but what Sean did was look at tests across the country, and he smoothed out the data so you could compare Michigan with Massachusetts, with Minnesota, and what he found isn't going to surprise a single person in this room, and that is if you're a child and you go to a school that has a predominant enrollment of children of color and or children of low-income family, you are below the mean when it comes to academic performance, way below the mean. And in fact, while the racial gap is slightly narrowing so that maybe in some of your lifetimes it would close if things improved, the economic one is not. The economic one is getting wider. And Dr. Wong said to me, you know, the schools that I work in the Los Angeles area, so interesting what you just said. In East Los Angeles, she said, because I've been dealing with vets who had come back from Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam and who were just fucked up in certain ways that they just couldn't process what's going on. And she said, you know, the PTSD rate of the students in East Los Angeles is higher than returning vets from Iraq and Afghanistan. And she said, if you want to do something that would have some impact on achievement gap, you could do worse than focusing on trauma. And that's at first blush what seems so crazy to us, except it's not crazy, right? Because things don't happen because they're crazy. They happen because there's a reason. They don't have schools like this where kids come and have to have these experiences, and there aren't mental health professionals, and there aren't these programs, and they're cutting these programs even more. They don't have them unless intentionally that's the way they want them to be. That's the way they want them to be. And she said you could do a lot worse than focusing on those issues and addressing the fact that, and I love the way, in your last slide, you talked about community, and that's the point. None of the cases I've talked about are IDEA cases. They are not special education cases. That's worthy of another conference and another discussion, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a community. A school-wide community that is committed to learning and committed to the futures of these particular teachers. And what she said was that this is a problem that the entire community needs to be part of in terms of figuring out what the remedy and the solution is, and in terms of addressing it in a meaningful sort of way. And so that was a lot of the impetus in terms of how to think about these sorts of questions. And I want to talk about this with you in the context of rights and frames as well as remedy. Rights and frames as well as remedies. Because I hope you will let me into your community as a lawyer, but I don't want to see you again in 5 years at this same conference discussing these same issues. These are children's rights. And there isn't a debate about this. I heard someone say earlier, well, we should talk to philanthropic groups about more resources and more power to those groups, and God knows where we'd be if they didn't exist. But nobody should be begging for these children to have an opportunity to learn. And if Brown and these principles mean anything, it means that children are given what they need. Now, I said, you know, I'm in schools in Detroit that don't have books and teachers, and nobody would call those a school. But it's part of our job, part of the privilege that we have in terms of being involved and connected to these children and their families and their communities, that this becomes part of the dialogue, so that if it's not a school because it doesn't have a teacher or a book, it's also not a school if it doesn't have mental health counselors. It's also not a school if it doesn't have trauma-sensitive programs, because children can't learn and teachers cannot teach under those sorts of circumstances. And you know, if you think about it, and I thought about it in the context of matters involving the vets, if you built a school and you didn't have a wheelchair ramp and you had a child with a wheelchair, you'd say, well, that child is being denied equal educational opportunity. That child is being denied meaningful access to education. Well, if you build a school and you don't put in trauma-sensitive practices, and these kids, and you know, I heard you speak once before, Dr. Lee, and others. What was so interesting about the discussions today is, to one degree or another, at a certain point, I was saying the same thing. This is brain science. This isn't philosophy. It isn't a fad. It isn't something. We know. We know how kids learn. And we know how to turn off the learning switch of kids. We know that children who get unaddressed trauma, over and over again, their brain gets rewired. These aren't bad kids. These aren't defective kids. These are healthy kids who are dealing the only way their brain knows how. And we have to respect that, and we have to deal with that. But we can do something about that because we know how to address trauma. And I want to come to Peter P. in a second. You know, when you do a lawsuit involving kids, you don't use their real names, and you let kids pick their own name. And so we said to this young man, you know, who do you want to be? He said, Peter. I said, who? Peter P. Peter Pan. Peter Pan. And Peter had lived on the top of that roof. And they wanted to arrest him for trespassing. And they wanted to suspend him. And a part of the story also are these expulsions and suspensions. And we've got to get them down, and the numbers are just as disproportionate or worse, as you say. Plus, there are all these sort of hidden expulsions, or hidden suspensions, like go to the teacher's office or transfer to another school. These kids just get on a bandwagon, so it doesn't get in the data as a suspension or an expulsion. But that's what's happening to these kids. And every time these kids change schools, that's traumatic. And every time these kids change schools, somebody talked about the Clark study. What are we saying to the kid? I mean, frankly, what are we saying to a kid when we tell them you go to a school like this? We're saying, you're not educable. You're not worth it. You're disposable. We don't care what happens to you. But expulsions and suspensions, besides the stupidity, and again, it's not stupid. They know what they're doing. When you keep a kid out of school, they're not going to get smarter. They're not going to get more educated. They're not going to get more into that culture that we're talking about. But it occurred to us that just putting the kid back in school, even if you were doing it purely, that doesn't address the core problem that the issues of trauma sensitivity are not being dealt with. So, of course, it's better to have the kid in school rather than out of school, but it still isn't addressing the issue itself. So we were thinking about this, and I know this is touchy, and I hope we get some questions on this. But you know, my role as a lawyer over 42 years, the privilege of being a lawyer, the total privilege of being a civil rights lawyer and working with individuals and groups and communities like this, is that we can be a piece of a much broader struggle, a struggle that long predated these particular circumstances. Well, here's the law. Here's the law. The legal principle is always the easiest part. Here's the law. Under our federal disability laws, if a child is identified as an individual with a disability, and we've got to talk about what that means, but individual with a disability, and if they are denied benefits of schools because of that disability, then their law is being violated. And I don't want to beg the federal government for help. That's the federal government's responsibility to deal with, any more than putting in a wheelchair chair or a ramp. Well, what is a definition? What's the definition? And that's where I hope we have a partnership, because I want to be part of your struggle to deal with these sorts of issues. What's the definition? The definition is any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities of an individual. What's a life activity of an individual? Doesn't have to be survival, only God knows it is. It certainly is for us and our kids. But a definition of a life is anything that is important, that's important to people's lives. And if there's any question about what that meant, in 2008, Congress amended the law and said, you're reading it too narrowly. Here's what it includes: learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, operation of major bodily functions, neurological, and brain functions. Well, you don't have to be a very good lawyer to figure out that's what school is. That's what happens in school. And you don't have to be a very good lawyer to listen to all of you say, when trauma operates to cut off that learning switch, when trauma turns states into traits, when trauma gets in the way of individuals and communities, of schools, that's a violation of the law. And that was the theory of the case. That, as I said earlier, if you couldn't eradicate poverty and economic disadvantage and the chaos in some of these schools, at least you could identify them for what they are, which I think is the essence of all lawyering. It's just telling the truth. Just telling the truth about what's going on. And Susan had a slide up that was perfect in terms of spelling it out. How does trauma work? It affects verbal processing and communication. The capacity to internalize new cognitive information. It affects cognitive development and memory. What happens? The brain sees these stressful circumstances, and instead of development of the hippocampus or the prefrontal cortex, it moves it into an area removed from higher level of critical thinking. It's fighting or flighting. It's dissociating. It's the only way to survive. So that if a kid, and you've seen this over and over, a teacher says, the phrases you've heard, I won't repeat them, but a teacher points a finger at a kid, or another teacher raises, boom! That kid sees that for what the kid's done, and the kid responds. Fighting or flighting, dissociating, or somehow not moving in. Trauma affects goal setting and long-term planning. Trauma affects classroom behaviors, the capacity to self-regulate. That's what it's about. And so when we went to federal court and said, it is the responsibility of schools to know their children, and they do know their children. Nobody becomes a teacher or an administrator because they don't like children. They know what these kids are going about trying to do, and they're trying to make done. The Compton school system, you heard Catherine say, they had no counselors, they had no mental health people. No mental health people for the school. They had one person who kind of circulated around, but mainly he just administered tests. But he wasn't addressing these sorts of issues, and he certainly wasn't addressing these needs. Which brings me to my very last point. When I deal with lawsuits, one thing I've learned over the years is lawsuits should work backwards. Too many lawyers come up with legal theories and think that's what drives the movement, or that's what drives the solution. No, it's just the other way around. You have to figure out what kids need, what that community needs. The first thing they need is a recognition of the role of trauma, a recognition of what they're putting into it. The second thing they need is a sort of participation and involvement in developing strategies that are organic to the particular school itself. The third thing they need is to make sure that a trauma-sensitive program isn't, it's not clinical in terms of a particular kid. It may be in some circumstances, but that's not what it's about. That pathologizes the kid. It is in building it into the community so the attendance officer and the security person and everybody understands what they're dealing with. It means restorative justice practices so that when there are issues in classrooms, and nobody in this room says classrooms should go wild, it's to the contrary. And finally, what it's about is making sure that there are skilled mental health professionals who know evidence-based programs, who are available to take that off the teachers' backs and to take it off the principals' back and to take it off the students' backs and actually get those programs into place. And then a structure so that those programs themselves can be developed. The last thing I want to say, the very last thing I want to say is this. It was not an accident. I don't think anything in life is an accident. It was not an accident that Peter ended up on the roof of that school. That's where he wanted that safe place. That's where he felt he could get a home. And when he got wrested off of that roof, they were telling him he didn't belong there. But the news is that these kids are extraordinary. Everybody here knows that. They are extraordinary. They inspire us. My kids, me, we were privileged in terms of the way we had education. These kids are struggling to learn because of their love of learning. And that's why we're going to win. And that's why we're going to win. We've got to get this story out. We've got to, I believe in lawsuits as part of that process, where communities won't do it otherwise, or they don't know about it otherwise. I am working very closely. I had dinner last week with the head of the Compton School Board and talking about strategies to use the lawsuit and other procedures to get more resources into the schools. But nobody, we can ask, but we cannot accept no for an answer. And that is why I am so glad to be among you. I see you as expert witnesses. I see some of you as plaintiffs, but I see all of you as friends and part of a community that I feel very grateful to be part of. Thank you very much.
So, thank you to our phenomenal panel. How much time do we have? So, I had all these questions, but I want to hear from you, so we're just going to open it up to the audience immediately. Your name, sir?
My name is Lionel. So as you guys were all talking, first off, thank you so much. You got it. In your next life, you should be a preacher. You get everybody going. It's really eye-opening because all you guys are talking about different systems. And a word that just popped into my head while you guys were talking was narrative. Narrative and empathy, those are two words that kind of came up. Little self-disclosure, I'm Haitian. I'm Haitian American, first generation Haitian American. So my narrative is a little different from the narrative of typical African Americans that grew up here. It's one that we would call a little bit more victorious if you know your history. So the way that I see the world is a little bit different. But then when I first encountered African Americans that were not like Caribbean or Haitian or this or that, and then you would talk about their struggle, the narrative by which they saw the world was completely different. And the input of that narrative came from all the multiple systems, whether it be family, whether it be the community, whether it be media, whether it be politics. So to tie it in a bow, you touched on something beautiful. People don't know about the beautiful culture and the educational systems that were in Africa and in Egypt, and they don't know even some of the stories that existed within the slavery portion. All you get is this narrative of destruction, of subordination, of less than. So there's almost a dance that has to be done within, from a micro, meso, and macro level. And what is from, and I'm going to go back to our government because I know what we can do, but what is it from a socio-political or political level, from the top? Where is the acknowledgement of the narrative and a sense of empathy that's needed? And if it's coming, or if it's not coming, what are the steps that are being taken so that from an institutional level, that could be recognized? Because I think that's going to springboard us into a next level.
Wow. That was awesome.
Yeah. Barack Obama couldn't do it. I mean, seriously, I think that I don't think it's coming from there. I mean, I think, well, I'll say this. I think it is there on every level, but it's not as powerful. It's not as strong as it needs to be to fight against the other things at all these different ecological levels.
Sure.
So I think we do have to do that education and broaden our collaborations. Like I tell Magnus and Justice, like they have an affirmation. They're 2.5. People are like, they have an affirmation. Yes, every day they say, I'm a great boy and I do great things. Because people tell, oh, double trouble. I say, no, double greatness. You know, so, and somebody mentioned Marian Edelman. She's been doing this work for years, but her voice is not as outstanding in terms of standing out enough to solve the problem. So I think it is, like, I am so inspired by this union today. And I wish that we had time to hear every voice because I don't know what the next steps are, but I think he's a powerful person that needs to keep this going. You know, and so it's like, what role can we play? Your voice was just so powerful, you know, so it's more of that. It's more of how do we get these things that we're doing out there and just start really doing the work, seeing where we can grab these different practices and implement them and go to the people who care about Black, brown, you know, who care about all lives, you know. So, yeah, that's my
So I'm trying to go sort of look at the audience, so from this side, and then I'll go that one back to the center. So, sir?
Hi, how you doing? Thank you all for awesome insight. My name is Dewan Alfred. I'm a graduate student here at Rutgers, Newark, and a community organizer in the city of Orange. I have a question because I've been getting a lot of administrative pushback in regards to doing work related to this T word, right, the trauma word. So I come from a background where both of my parents are still currently drug addicts, and I've watched, you know, this presentation kind of lists a number of backgrounds where you can check a box, but you know, drug addict leads to separation of households. My mother was incarcerated in jail, and my best friend was murdered. It's an array of all of these things that I would gladly check off. I did the ACEs test during lunch. I got 9 out of 10 of them. But I'm thinking about this because I had the courage to first go see a therapist that was offered through Rutgers University for the first time in my life. And so clap for me. So sitting across the desk from this therapist and talking about the things that I had experienced, where in one instance, on my way to graduate school to talk about redlining and doing a presentation, I'm catching the bus to